Almost there.
Before I start this video in full, I wanted to acknowledge that to a lot of people I'm going to be pronouncing the name of the title wrong. See, H.P Lovecraft in his infinite genius decided to give us a mascot with a name that he didn't want humans to be able to pronounce properly. And as such, there are a lot of different ways that people try to say it. Now, I'm going to butcher it, but based on Lovecraft's own notes, the closest I can manage to what I think was his intention is to call it Call of Cthulhu. But again, Lovecraft's entire point was that this creature was so far removed beyond comprehension that our vocal boxes were simply incapable to create the sounds necessary to pronounce the name properly. The way I enunciate it in my head when I read Lovecraft is Cthulhu. And again, I know a lot of people are going to disagree with that pronunciation, and in purest terms, you're probably right. But out of sheer convenience, it's the way that I'm most comfortable wrapping my tongue around it. So please forgive me for using that pronunciation, purists. I know it's going to annoy you, but I'll try and minimize how many times I say it, so I don't frustrate you too often. And with that, we can get on to the video. H.P. Lovecraft's brand of horror is very difficult to actually replicate in a highly visual medium, such as television, film, or in video games. A lot of stuff that shares an aesthetic resemblance to Lovecraft's vivid descriptions of his worlds is often chalked up as Lovecraftian, but in reality, a genuinely authentic recreation of Lovecraft's style is so incredibly rare to come across. And that's why the newly released Call of Cthulhu is so impressive to me. It's one of the few games that genuinely understands what makes Lovecraft so compelling.
Officer Bradley,
but before we talk about the game, I wanted to talk briefly about one of the most perfect Lovecraft stories in highlighting his kind of blend and philosophy of horror in a very simple and clean way. That story is called The Statement of Randolph Carter. I highly recommend that everybody read that one, because while it's only a couple of pages long and lacks the vivid settings and investigative process of many of Lovecraft's other stories, it does boil the horror right down to the core of what is in Lovecraft and what we think about when we think about Lovecraft as a storyteller. Basically, Randolph Carter is a story about two treasure hunters that find themselves at an ancient cemetery, following a lead that beneath one of these graves in the cemetery is an extended underground crypt and God knows what kind of treasure. They find this crypt, and Carter, the character who the story is named after, remains on the surface, while his accomplice, a guy called Harley Warren, descends down to explore the crypt. They remain in contact with one another over a two-way radio, But then Carter starts to hear some horrific things over the radio, and Warren's screams of pain and so on. That disturbing scene terrifies Carter to the point that he flees, and he is later arrested for Warren's disappearance. We don't find him again, basically. So like I said, it's a very simple and very short story, but through the statement of Randolph Carter, we can understand why Lovecraft's horror is so distinctive and effective, and why it doesn't work so well as a visual thing. Basically, Lovecraft's horror comes from the reader never seeing the monster. We see the impact that the creature has, be that a disappearing Warren, or a passage in the story to the effect of the protagonist saw this thing and he's insane now. We get that kind of impression of the monster, but Lovecraft never actually over-describes encounters with the monsters, and when he does talk about the monsters, he does so in the most general sense possible, and often from a second-hand source. The idea being that the reader never gets a firm idea of what this monster really is. And the intent of doing that is quite obvious. There's nothing that can be shown that can't be more terrifying by unleashing the imagination. But unfortunately, that idea, that principle, doesn't work so well in film. I know because I've actually tried to do it myself. Back in university, when I was studying film production, I had to create a short film with a couple of other people, and we decided that we would do an adaptation of the statement of Randolph Carter. That was a relatively easy story to film, it doesn't require too many special effects, actors, all that kind of stuff. So it was a good project for a university student, but we struggled a great deal in actually creating that, because the story makes it quite clear that 90% of the entire experience of that story basically involves one guy standing in a graveyard looking down a hole and listening to weird things over a walkie-talkie. It just isn't scary when it's pictured. It's much more scary when you can use your imagination to just think about what poor old Warren is actually experiencing. Other films and games have toyed with the idea of making the monsters explicit as a way of adapting Lovecraft. So Lovecraft describes Cthulhu in a very vague way as a giant monster thing with an octopus head, for example. But when this happens in a visual medium, what happens to the audience is the text drops the psychological mind games out of the experience and turns into something much more kind of B-grade, rather than resembling an a contemporary American Gothic aesthetic and tone. It's more, I guess, a slasher kind of experience. And I'll give some examples. So there was a film that was released a fair few years ago now called Dagon, and it's actually a pretty decent approximation of Lovecraft's finest work, which is A Shadow Over Innsmouth, in the way it just tells its story. And it is a reasonably enjoyable little horror film, but it comes across as much more akin to something like Friday the 13th or Halloween or whatever, than something more highbrow and psychologically based again, like The Exorcist. Over in video games, there is Bethesda's pretty enjoyable Call of Cthulhu, Dark Corners of the Earth. Its opening chapter is also based on Shadows Over Innsmouth, coincidentally, but while that game does a really good job of avoiding being an endless sequence of shootouts and the like many other horror games do, the heavy reliance on stealth and the heavy reliance of having a physical threat in the enemies that can shoot at you or attack you still means that it's far too action-based to really capture the slow-burning mood of a proper Lovecraftian story. So with that as background, I was actually quite concerned going into this new Call of Cthulhu game that which is the one that you're watching samples of on the screen, that what was going to happen was it was going to track along with Dark Corners of the Earth. It would be a Lovecraftian-ish story, but ultimately it would have those action sequences, it would have a lot of depictions of monsters and all that, and it would no longer feel Lovecraftian as a result. It's explicitly based on the old pen and paper game of the same name by the company called Chaosism. And as we all know, in video games, when you tell somebody that you're making an RPG, there's that expectation that there'll be an emphasis on combat and other physical activities. So I was also concerned that a lot of the promotional material was really making that link to the pen and paper RPG quite explicit, because I thought that that would mean that the developers, Cyanide, would try to make it an RPG for people who are used to playing video game RPGs. I'm quite pleased to say that Call of Cthulhu has proved me comprehensively wrong on all of my concerns. And this is, like I said at the start of the video, one of the stronger attempts to do Lovecraft's work justice that we have seen to date. Most importantly of all, it's not reliant on monsters, and indeed there is such a slow build-up to the genuinely supernatural stuff, if that happens at all. I'm not going to give any kind of spoilers about what to expect from this game, because that's clearly what the developers did not want people to do, and discovering it for yourself is a big part of the experience. But for the longest time you'll feel like something's coming, only for something much more mundane to happen. And as a result, the tension about that expectation, that weight of expectation, just builds and builds and builds and builds. And from that tension, there's that real sense of unease about what's going to happen, and it really infuses the game right from the start. You play as a detective, and you're set on a task to figure out what's happened to a woman that has showed up dead. And that's not a spoiler, that happens right in the very start, the very introduction. She's an artist though, and right from the start you are exposed to her vividly disturbing images that she painted just before her death. And this is a really clever way for the developers at Cyanide to show us the impact of what we think is going to be the supernatural things that we face later on, and we assume that we will eventually encounter them, but we haven't encountered them yet. But this is a way for the developer to show us what they're doing. So all we can see is that the woman has seen something that has caused her to suffer some kind of psychological break. And again, we don't know what it is, but we know it's happened. And that's exactly how Lovecraft would have wanted it. It's not so much about the experience of the monster, it's about the lead up to that experience of the monster. That's where the horror comes from. Even as the game pushes on, it actively resists the urge to slip into a standard monsters and stealth experience. The first prolonged stealth experience, for example, places you in a mental asylum and you need to figure out how to escape. And while it is a chillingly creepy place to explore and learn the secrets to, the enemies that you're avoiding are again just regular humans. And that's hours and hours into the game. For the longest time, Call of Cthulhu sits right up on the potential for the occult magic and cosmic horrors to take over, but it never seems to tip over that precipice. And again, I'm not giving away any spoilers here. I'm not saying whether the game does have supernatural elements later on, whether that is all just a fabrication of a weakening mind in the case of your protagonist, because he does suffer some mental issues, and his sanity, his grip on sanity does start to degrade as he finds more and more horrific things in this world. I'm not saying whether any of this stuff actually happens, because that's the kind of the excitement of the game, but what I'm saying is the game just does such a good job of really taking its time to build to that point, and that's really important for a Lovecraftian story. As for the way the game handles the RPG side of the Call of Cthulhu pen and paper game, I'm also deeply in love with that, because the Cyanide team have clearly taken the time to really understand what is Lovecraft and what is it about Lovecraft that works as an RPG-like experience. Lovecraft's stories are never about combat or physical feats. Rather, his protagonists are quite bookish. They're detectives or analysts or researchers or students. And when you level up in Call of Cthulhu, it's those skills that you actually improve. You improve your ability to spot clues, or you improve your ability to get extra information out of a person by asking them more detailed questions, for example. Your familiarity with exotic medicines and books and the occult, all of these things improve as you go deeper into the game and get more experience. And those things in turn help you dig further into the depths of the horror that you're only just kind of starting to begin to comprehend at the start of the game. And that's really, really clever way of doing things. That's statistics-driven gameplay, which is what people obviously like from RPGs. That's why people keep buying RPGs, and it's one of the oldest genres out there. Those statistics, however, are tuned in a way that is more about the detective work and the storytelling as opposed to the combat. And that is really the difference between the pen and paper versions of Call of Cthulhu and something like Dungeons and Dragons as well. Dungeons and Dragons is all about the combat and the dice rolls and all that. Call of Cthulhu is more about facilitating a storytelling experience. And that is transitioned into this game perfectly, like really, really well. And there's also plenty of different ways that you can approach a lot of different challenges in this game. There's a sense of openness about what you can do to get to your next objective, which again feels very much like roleplay, especially when some of the paths actually involve kind of character interaction and roleplay and all that kind of stuff. That's all part of the game. So it feels like a fully fledged, almost non-linear RPG at times, but at the same time, it does it without relying on combat and violence and monsters and stuff, which would not be appropriate to a genuine Call of Cthulhu game. Now, I have absolutely no idea how this Call of Cthulhu game is actually going to be received in the market. I suspect it's not doing itself any favours by being released so close to Red Dead Redemption. But putting that aside, it's something that I think a lot of people are going to find to be an odd mix. It's effectively a monster horror story, but without the monsters. Or you're unsure about whether the monsters are going to be there through the longest part of the story. It's an RPG based on a classic pen and paper RPG, but it's not a physical RPG. There's no combat really to think about. There's no magic, there's no swords, there's no guns. None of that kind of stuff plays a big role in Call of Cthulhu. And it behaves so much like a walking simulator for such a long period of its time, was through large sections of it. But then it goes and does other things like stealth and other kind of sequences or adventure game mechanics and stuff like that. So it feels like this interesting mash of genres and types and approaches, which I don't know is going to gel particularly well with an awful lot of people out there. I guess what I'm saying is it's quite eclectic, which is probably the way that Lovecraft would have liked it, one suspects, but whether that's going to resonate with a video game playing audience remains to be seen. Certainly people who have fond memories of Dark Corners of the Earth, the Bethesda game from a decade or so ago, that's probably the best example, I guess, of a Call of Cthulhu game to date, and people who expect more of that and come into this one are going to find it quite a bit different, I imagine, and whether they find that to be a good different or bad different, that remains to be seen. But I love it, and I highly recommend it, and I hope you enjoyed this video because hopefully you've seen some things that have interested you about the game, and it gives you a little bit more context about where this game sits within the more broad Lovecraftian world. But basically what I want to say is, if you're a fan of narrative-driven horror or Lovecraft, make sure you check this out, because this, to me, as a big fan of Lovecraft, spent a lot of time reading, researching, doing analysis of Lovecraft. As a huge fan of Lovecraft, I don't think there are many examples that are better than this out there, and I think the purity of it deserves props. So thanks very much for watching this video, and we'll see you at the next one.
Source of this miracle. You mean